Hi folks, welcome back to Aeon Pro. It's another new week, which means it's time to go over the top stories in tech and gaming from last week. First thing we're going to talk about is the first official completely ray-traced game. Well, sort of. Turns out somebody decided that they were going to take ray tracing into the world of Quake 2. Now this is an older game that doesn't really require a lot by modern computer standards to run. So what they did was they created a way to path trace the game, which essentially is ray tracing, but according to the camera's perspective. What that means is that things that are not being shown on the camera are not being ray traced. However, the game world is still rendering them. Once the camera turns in their direction, rays are then shot from the camera's perspective to the object, to the light source. So it's sort of like reverse ray tracing. Instead of being pinpointed from the light and creating those ray tracing effects in the entire environment, it only renders them on what's on the screen at any given time. It is a way to kind of lower the CPU cost or the graphical processing cost of the entire process, but it is still technically ray tracing. The guys over at UFD Tech actually have a great video showing off this game both in like 1080p and 1440p, as well as lower resolutions like 640 by 480 or 720p. One of the interesting things that they showed was that it can run with an RTX 2060, but if you're playing it at 1440p with that 2060, it's only getting around 30 frames per second. With the 2080 Ti, it was actually getting over 80 frames per second on average, which is impressive, but it also goes to show just how intensive ray tracing is, even when it's path tracing, not full-on ray tracing. Kind of interesting to show that, one, there's still a long way to go before ray tracing is 100% finalized for things like AAA titles on modern platforms. The guys over at Battlefield clearly have done a very good job at optimizing the game to run with the frame rates that we're getting now, even on the 2080 Ti. If Quake 2 is having a hard time running at above 60 frames per second on even an RTX 2060, it kind of shows you that there's a lot more involved in the processing and rendering of real-time ray tracing than was originally, sort of marketed to us. NVIDIA really did a good job of marketing this whole ray tracing idea, and as we all know, it didn't go out the way that they were expecting or we were expecting. It does require a lot more computational power than we were expecting. So this is an interesting, I guess, field study in ray tracing, and it does show us that the technology is there, but it's got a long way to go before it's going to be something that can be in every computer or every household. Next up on our list, we have to talk about Flexgate, because everything is a gate these days. You can't just have something happen. Turns out 2016 MacBook Pros are having a little bit of a problem with the lighting from the bottom of the screen. What it is that the ribbon cable that connects the display to the computer itself was made extremely flexible, and they had to do this in order to make it all fit inside the incredibly small form factor of the MacBook Pro. Unfortunately, it's so thin and so flexible that it's actually degraded. And so if there's a break in those cables, that's causing these display issues, which unfortunately they're saying the only real way to solve this issue is to completely replace the screen, because they're Apple and they don't want to just replace a ribbon cable, which would be cheap. They're going to replace the entire screen, which is expensive. On top of the fact that the whole right to repair thing is still sort of ongoing, this is not going to be something that's going to be easily solved by yourself. You probably are going to have to go into a registered Mac repair shop and have them order the parts and fix it for you, because that's just the way Apple does things. One of the things I told myself when we started this show is that I wanted to kind of stay away from rumors, but these ones have been circulating pretty much every day. There was new information for the past week, so I do want to talk about it briefly. There's talk about a 1660 Ti from NVIDIA. This would be essentially a 2060 without the ray tracing. The naming convention there is a little weird. We don't have a 16 series of cards. Calling it an 1160 would make a lot of sense, but a 1660 is a little bit of a stretch. Also calling it a Ti when there's no regular 1660, also a bit of a stretch. But we'll have to see. These rumors have been circulating a lot. I've been seeing them in multiple places, and unfortunately, nothing has really been finalized yet. There are supposedly numbers, CUDA cores, things like that. I'm not going to go into it just because it's not substantiated. It's still a rumor at this point. NVIDIA hasn't confirmed that this is coming, but I figured I would at least talk about it in passing since it has been sort of the talk of the tech world for the last week. In weird news that I don't think is going to matter to anybody in the United States, two Chinese phone companies, Meizu and Vivo, have both announced that they're going to be releasing phones that have no ports and no buttons. These are going to be completely touchscreen. I believe the Meizu Zero and the Vivo Apex 2019. Now, the Meizu Zero is supposed to have a camera, a front-facing camera under the display, which is why they don't need to have a notch or a button for the camera to take a picture. No word yet on what quality photos those things are going to take, but the technology is there, so I guess we'll kind of experience it all together when they come out. I'm not a big fan of either of these phones. They don't have headphone jacks, kind of taking a note from Apple there, a note that most people, as far as I understand it, were not happy about. And it's kind of an interesting idea, I guess. They're both very waterproof. They both do what they're supposed to do as far as that's concerned, but it is kind of a strange choice. I think the general moving away from buttons atmosphere, in my opinion, my personal opinion, is the wrong move. I think a lot of what people look for in phones is some sort of tactile feedback. I know I personally have the vibrate function on it when I'm typing so that it tells me that it actually took my input. Which obviously that's going to be something that these phones can have as well, but completely getting rid of buttons is a little interesting. It means there's no power button. It means there's no, volume up, volume down. So we'll have to see how things like restarting the phone or getting into your dev options are going to be. No word yet on what format these are going to run on. My guess is Android. But, it's kind of hard to say with these Chinese phone companies. A lot of times they have their own proprietary OS. And they might not even release these phones in the West. So we'll have to keep our eyes peeled and see what happens. See if those come over here, and then we'll alert you guys if reviewers start talking about them. Now, we do have a bit of a press F to pay respects moment. It looks like the guys who bought out the YouTube channel Machinima have decided that it wasn't worth it to keep the YouTube up at all. They took down everything. The entire library of Machinima videos is gone. Now, my personal take on Machinima aside, they've had videos on YouTube for the better part of a decade. It's a little bit surprising that the parent company that bought them out would decide to just get rid of all of them. No warning, no announcement, they just were gone one day. There's a little bit of a movement online to kind of archive and recover some of those videos, but if you're a subscriber of Machinima, you may want to go through your subscriptions and see if you even have any videos left. Strong likelihood you don't, unless you have a pre-cached version of those videos. Those are gone. So yeah, F in the comments for Machinima. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is a little bit of a personal story. I feel I need to talk about My Time at Portia's. Now, for those of you who don't know, I've said it a couple times on the channel, but I work as a voice actor, and I try not to bring in voice actor struggles or news into this channel because I do want this to remain about technology and gaming. But this is something that I think affects gaming as a whole, not just voice actors. This game has been in development for I want to say about a year and a half, and they hired 60 voice actors. That is a very large voice cast, especially for an indie studio, but they did, and that's what they were doing. The problem with this company's handling of this process is significant. A number of issues, both around communication as well as payment of the actors. There were a lot of actors who, as recently as last week, after the game released, who hadn't been paid for work that they did for the game. There's been a couple of announcements from people behind My Time at Portia, or My Time at Portia's. They first made an announcement in October because a thread showed up on Steam on the Steam page for My Time at Portia regarding this issue, regarding voice actors who hadn't been paid. The thread was up for maybe about a day, and it was closed because they stated that they were going to be reaching out to the voice actors, making sure everyone got paid, making sure that this was all made good. This was a year after some of these voice actors had signed on to voice for the game. A year later, they still had to publicly state, "We have not been paid." Supposedly that was supposed to be resolved back in October. However, come January, I was hearing, as well as several other people who are involved in the voice acting world were hearing from the cast members of this game that there was still work they had not been paid for. On top of that, you have issues of extremely fast turnaround times to the point where a character might be completely recast if you couldn't get lines into them within 2 or 3 days. This is within 2 or 3 days for work that you still haven't been paid for the last several months. This was a big issue. I tend to get up on a soapbox when it comes to paying people for their time. Whether you're an actor, game designer, coding, art, anything like that. If there's a deadline, there should be a deadline for payment as well. A lot of these issues seem to stem from communication. Voice actors would send emails, containing their lines, and then would never hear back that their lines were received. They would then be asked for more lines without any indication that the previous lines were accepted. There was also no information regarding when they were going to get paid for the work they'd already done. This was just an ongoing problem. And for it to have supposedly been solved in October, by January, when I was still hearing this, it looked like many people still had not received payment. Last week, the developers behind My Time at Portia put up another post explaining that this was a learning process, that they were, not prepared for this undertaking, which on the one hand is fine, but on the other hand, they'd been working on it for a year and a half. With these issues being brought up in October, that was 3 months ago. It shouldn't take 3 months to do what you said you were going to do in October in regards to paying people for their work. So it's an interesting situation. As of right now, from what I'm hearing, everyone has been paid once a big stink was made about it for the second time after the game's release. So while I was encouraging people to refrain from buying or playing the game until these actors had been paid, it looks like they have been. So if you're interested in playing the game, by all means. But I do want to say that from an industry perspective, this is a bad look for this company. They've had an issue with games in the past not being finished, even though they were kickstarted. So to come up with another game that was 150% funded on Kickstarter, to have been out for a week and a half before people were paid for their work during a year and a half of development, that's a bad look. And while everyone has growing pains and everyone needs some time to learn these things, when you had people going throughout the entire process telling you this is not the way you do things, they'd had to rewrite contracts several times because originally they were not even being paid close to enough for the amount of work that was being requested. And then on top of that, there were things like them not telling people that they wanted lines individually cut and edited, and that takes more time, so that would be more payment for the actor if they have to take their own time to do that. That's just the way that things work within the industry. And so this was just all stuff that would have been readily available to them if they were in any sort of regular communication. But the fact that every time a voice actor would reach out to them, it would be met with silence, kind of made everything just snowball until they had to speak publicly about it, because the company was able to boast #1 sales on Steam opening weekend, but they couldn't pay their actors? So I think I've ranted about this long enough, but this is one of those things that really gets me upset. And so I think it's important that anyone who's interested in getting involved in gaming development, or anything involving voice actors in general, just remember these are people whose lives depend on the paychecks that they get for the work that they do. If you're demanding a high amount of work from them, including fast turnaround times, self-editing their own lines, These are things that need to be factored into your budget for voice acting. If you're looking to hire voice actors, you have to remember to pay those voice actors, and preferably in a timely fashion. A month or two is understandable, but a year without payment, that's too much. So that's going to do it for this week in review. Thanks for watching as always. If you feel there was a story that we didn't talk about or you wanted to hear more about, feel free to comment in the section down below letting us know exactly what you want to hear. My inbox is always open, so if there are stories that you catch wind of that you want to direct our attention to, feel free to send them to us either through YouTube or you can catch us also on Twitter. And if you are interested in helping us out, we'll be happy to throw a little notification your way. We'll be sure to credit you in the video. As always, this has been Mark, and we'll catch you guys next time.